Before we begin, take a slow breath. Settle in. What follows is a story told in quiet moments. Images, voices, and time folding back on itself. Thank you for lending us your attention tonight. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, consider subscribing and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know who shares this room with us. How does a kingdom that raised the pyramids begin to come apart? The fall of Egypt's old kingdom was not a sudden crash, but a slow unthreading of power, food, and trust along the Nile. To understand why the old kingdom collapsed, we first need to understand what, exactly, was collapsing. This was the age of pyramids, the age of divine kingship at its most confident. Roughly spanning dynasties 3 through 6, from around 2686 to 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom is often remembered as a time of order, wealth, and extraordinary ambition. At its center stood the Pharaoh, not simply as a ruler, but as the living point where religion, government, and the natural world seemed to meet. The monuments of this era still shape how we imagine ancient Egypt. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the Great Pyramids at Giza, vast mortuary complexes, processional ways, reliefs of officials bringing tribute, counting cattle, recording harvests. None of this was possible without a strong central state. Stone had to be quarried and transported. Labor had to be organized. Food had to be collected, stored, and redistributed. Priests, scribes, overseers, and provincial administrators all had to work within a system that, at least on the surface, seemed remarkably stable. But stability can be deceptive. A kingdom like this depended on more than monuments. It depended on the annual Nile inundation. It depended on reliable taxation. It depended on the crown being able to command both loyalty and resources from regions far from the royal court. The pyramids suggest permanence. Yet the very complexity that made this state impressive also made it vulnerable. If the river failed, if officials became independent, if royal authority thinned even slightly, pressure could spread through the whole structure. So the mystery is not why a weak state fell. The mystery is how such a strong one slowly stopped holding together. The answer begins in the hidden machinery behind the stone. Ancient Egypt was often described as the gift of the Nile. That phrase is familiar, but in the Old Kingdom, it was more than poetry. It was the basis of the state. Each year, the river rose and spread water and fertile silt across the floodplain. When the inundation was high enough, fields could produce grain in abundance. When the harvest was strong, the state could collect taxes, support temples, feed laborers, and maintain the bureaucracy that made centralized rule possible. This meant that political power in Egypt was tied directly to ecology. The king did not rule over a landscape of constant abundance. He ruled over a system that had to be renewed every year. Scribes measured fields. Officials assessed grain. Storehouses filled and emptied. Redistribution was not a side function of the state. It was one of its foundations. That foundation helps explain how pyramid building worked. Contrary to old fantasies, these monuments were not raised by endless masses of slaves dragged through permanent misery. They were supported by organized labor and by a state capable of moving food, tools, and people on a very large scale. When flood and harvest aligned with administration, Egypt could convert agricultural surplus into stone architecture on a scale few ancient societies could match. But that same dependence created fragility. If flood levels dropped repeatedly, grain collection would shrink. If grain shrank, royal projects suffered. Local officials might keep more resources close to home. Temples and estates would compete more intensely for what remained. In a kingdom built on seasonal predictability, environmental stress could quickly become political stress. The Nile did not merely support the Old Kingdom, it quietly set the limits of its power. For much of the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh's authority appears overwhelming in royal art and official ideology. But states are not measured only by the images they project. They are also measured by what happens beyond the capital, in districts, estates, and provincial towns. And over time, the evidence suggests that power in Egypt was becoming more distributed than the pyramids alone might imply. A key part of this story involves provincial governors, often called nomarchs. These local elites administered regions on behalf of the crown. In theory, they served the king. In practice, over generations, many became deeply rooted in their own territories. Offices that may once have depended more directly on royal appointment increasingly appear to have become hereditary in some places, passing within powerful families. That mattered because the Old Kingdom depended on central reach. The crown needed provincial officials to collect taxes, manage labor, maintain order, and transmit loyalty up the chain of command. If those officials remained obedient, the system worked. If they began acting more like regional dynasts, the balance changed. The monarchy still existed. The symbols of kingship remained. But its effective power could narrow without any single dramatic rebellion. Archaeology hints at this shift in subtle ways. Provincial tombs became grander. Local identities became more visible. Elite families outside the royal center could present themselves with growing confidence and prestige. This does not mean Egypt instantly fractured. It means the state may have been decentralizing long before the formal end of the Old Kingdom. That slow drift is important. Collapse often looks sudden in hindsight, but many collapses begin as quiet negotiations of power. The center asks, the provinces answer. Then, over time, the center asks again, and the provinces no longer need to listen in the same way. It is tempting to imagine that a civilization declines only after its greatest achievements are over. But history is often less tidy than that. In Egypt, the very centuries associated with grandeur may also have contained the seeds of strain. Monument building continued, royal cults expanded, temples and funerary institutions accumulated land, labor obligations and endowments meant to sustain ritual forever. Here, historians begin to debate the deeper economics of the Old Kingdom. Some argue that the expanding web of mortuary endowments, tax exemptions, and elite estates may have slowly weakened the fiscal base of the crown. In simple terms, if more resources were set aside for temples or privileged institutions, fewer might remain under direct royal control. That would not destroy the kingdom overnight, but over generations it could make the monarchy less flexible, especially in times of scarcity. The difficulty is that the scale of this effect is hard to measure precisely. Ancient evidence is uneven. What survives is fragmentary. So this is not a neat formula in which one policy caused collapse. Still, the possibility matters because it reminds us that states can look magnificent while becoming less resilient underneath. A great pyramid is a display of surplus. A funerary cult is a long-term claim on labor and goods. A noble's estate is both a local center of power and a drain on the pool from which the king must govern. If the overall system is prosperous, these obligations can coexist. If the system comes under pressure, they become harder to balance. So while later generations looked back on the Old Kingdom as an age of majestic certainty, it may already have been carrying burdens that were easier to ignore in good years than in bad ones. Monumental stone can hide administrative weakness for a very long time. No ruler is discussed more often in the story of the Old Kingdom's fall than Pepi II. He is traditionally remembered as having ruled for an extraordinarily long time, perhaps beginning as a child and remaining on the throne deep into old age. Whether every detail of that reign can be reconstructed with confidence is another matter. But historians have long treated his reign as a window into the vulnerabilities of late Old Kingdom rule. The basic idea is easy to grasp. A very long reign may bring continuity, but it can also create uncertainty. If a king outlives heirs, rivals, and generations of senior officials, succession can become more complicated. Court networks age, offices fill with entrenched figures. Policies may drift rather than change decisively. Local elites have more time to consolidate their own positions while still operating under the fading prestige of the crown. It is important to be careful here. Pepi II did not simply wake up one day and cause the collapse of Egypt. That would be too simple, and the evidence does not support such a dramatic personal blame story. His reign is better understood as a focal point, a period in which long-building structural problems may have become harder to manage. If royal authority was already thinning in the provinces, and if the economic base of the monarchy was already under pressure, then a prolonged and possibly stagnant reign could magnify those problems. Later storytelling often prefers a final king, a last face to place on an ending. Real history is usually less theatrical. Pepi II matters not because he alone explains the collapse, but because his reign sits at the edge where accumulated weaknesses begin to show through the surface. The stone monuments remained. The institution of kingship remained. But the system underneath may already have been growing old. If the system underneath the monarchy was already aging, then the next question is simple. What happened when nature stopped cooperating? Ancient Egypt depended on a pattern that seemed almost eternal. Each year the Nile rose, spread water and fertile silt, and made agriculture possible along a narrow green corridor in a very dry land. The state did not just benefit from that cycle, it was built on it. Taxes, labor drafts, food storage, temple offerings, and royal generosity all assumed that the harvest would arrive in dependable rhythm. Around 2200 BCE, evidence points to a wider episode of aridification, often called the 4.2 kiloyear event. Across parts of North Africa and the Near East, climate conditions appear to have shifted. In Egypt, that likely meant weaker Nile floods in some years, perhaps repeatedly. That is a devastating possibility. A poor inundation was not merely bad weather, it threatened the grain base of the entire political order. When fields produce less, the consequences spread outward in every direction. Farmers had less to eat, officials had less to collect, storehouses had less to redistribute. The crown had fewer resources with which to reward loyalty, fund cults, or maintain distant authority. Even a strong government would have struggled under repeated low floods. A government already facing provincial independence and fiscal strain would have struggled far more. This does not mean climate alone toppled the old kingdom. That would be too neat. But environmental stress may have turned manageable weakness into open crisis. A centralized state can look permanent when the river behaves. It can suddenly look fragile when the river does not. When historians try to picture this period, one of the most haunting themes is hunger. Later texts and inscriptions from the first intermediate period speak of famine, distress, and communities under pressure. Among the best known are the inscriptions associated with local elites such as Ankhtifi, a provincial ruler who described himself as feeding the hungry and preserving order while others suffered. These accounts are vivid. They give us a world in which local strongmen stepped forward as protectors when wider systems failed. But we have to move carefully here. Ancient inscriptions were not neutral reports. They were public self-portraits. Anktefi was presenting himself as capable, generous, and necessary. So when he speaks of feeding his region or outshining rivals, he may be describing real hardship, but he is also shaping memory in his own favor. This is one of the hardest parts of studying collapse. The surviving voices are often the people who benefited from presenting disorder in a particular way. Even so, these texts matter. They suggest that food insecurity was serious enough to become part of political language. That alone is revealing. A ruler boasts about what people fear most. If he claims to have stopped hunger, then hunger was credible. If he claims to have imposed order, then disorder was imaginable. So we should not treat every famine description as literal proof of equal disaster everywhere. But neither should we dismiss them. They point to a society in which survival, distribution, and local authority had become deeply entangled. In times of abundance, legitimacy flows from splendor. In times of scarcity, legitimacy flows from bread. As pressure mounted, provincial power was no longer just a slow, administrative trend. It became a political fact on the ground. During the later Old Kingdom and into the First Intermediate period, regional governors, often called nomarchs, appear more visible, more self-assured, and more deeply rooted in their own territories. Some offices were increasingly tied to families. Some local rulers invested in their own tombs, inscriptions, and prestige. They did not present themselves as minor clerks. They presented themselves as the guardians of their districts. This shift matters because a kingdom is not held together by titles alone. It is held together by practical dependence. If a provincial governor can collect resources locally, command labor locally, build influence locally, and justify his own authority through local cult and local generosity, then his reliance on the royal center begins to shrink. He may still honor the king in language and ritual, but the balance has changed. In a healthy centralized state, local elites extend royal power. In a weakening one, they can begin to replace it. Not always openly, not always at once. Often the transition is gradual, almost polite on the surface. A governor still uses the symbols of loyalty while acting with growing autonomy in daily life. That is why collapse can be hard to see until late. The forms remain familiar. The offices remain familiar. The inscriptions may still praise kingship. Yet the actual machinery of decision-making has moved outward into the provinces, where ambitious families are learning how to govern without waiting for distant command. Once that happens, the royal state is no longer losing only revenue. It is losing habit. People begin to live politically at a different scale. After the end of Dynasty 6, the breakdown of strong centralized kingship becomes clearer. Egypt did not vanish. It fragmented. Rival centers of power emerged, most notably Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. This is the world historians call the First Intermediate Period. The phrase can sound like a brief pause between more glorious ages. In reality, it was a time of reorganization, competition, and regional adaptation. This distinction is important. The old picture of total collapse, of a civilization simply falling into darkness, is too blunt. Some areas surely suffered deeply. Some communities faced hunger, insecurity, and political violence. But archaeological evidence also suggests continuity in other places. People continued to bury their dead, commission art, build locally, and maintain social life. Culture did not stop. Egypt was not erased. Authority was redistributed. That may be unsettling because it forces us to rethink what collapse means. From the perspective of the pharaoh and the centralized court, This was a dramatic failure. The old national framework had fractured. But from the perspective of a provincial household, reality may have been more uneven. A distant king mattered less than the local ruler who could keep canals maintained, grain stored, and roads passable. So the fall of the Old Kingdom was both severe and incomplete. Severe because the long-standing concentration of power in the monarchy broke apart. Incomplete because life continued through smaller structures. What ended was not Egypt itself. What ended was one way of organizing Egypt. And in that distinction lies much of the story. By this point, the temptation is to choose one explanation. To say the Old Kingdom collapsed because of climate, or because of Pepi II, or because provincial governors became too powerful, or because the monarchy gave away too much land, revenue, and privilege to temples and elite estates. Each of these ideas captures part of the picture. None seems sufficient on its own. The more convincing view is also the less dramatic one. The Old Kingdom probably fell because several pressures met at once. Central power had been thinning over generations. Provincial offices had become more entrenched. The Crown's economic base may have been weakened by obligations and exemptions whose full scale is still debated. Then environmental stress likely reduced the Nile floods on which the entire system depended. Once harvests faltered, every political weakness became more dangerous. That is how complex states often fail. Not as a clean line from strength to ruin, but as a chain reaction. A bad climate phase hurts revenue. Lower revenue weakens patronage. Weaker patronage strengthens local independence. Stronger local independence makes coordinated response harder. Harder response deepens crisis. None of these steps has to be absolute. They only have to reinforce one another. So the collapse of the Old Kingdom was probably not a single disaster with a single date and a single villain. It was a convergence. A long centralization project lost its margin for error. And once that margin was gone, drought, local ambition, succession strain, and fiscal erosion no longer acted as separate problems. They became one crisis. In the next part of the story, we move deeper into that fractured landscape to see how people lived through the aftermath and how Egypt slowly rebuilt a new kind of state from the ruins of the old one. What followed was not a blank space. It was a different political landscape. The old royal centre had weakened, but villages still planted fields, workshops still made goods, and local officials still tried to keep order. For ordinary people, the greatest question was often not who claimed the throne in distant Memphis, but whether food could be stored, canals could be cleared, and violence could be avoided. In times of strain, the scale of survival becomes smaller. It shifts from empire to district, from dynasty to household. This is one reason the first intermediate period should be approached carefully. Later Egyptian texts often described it as an age of disorder, a time when the moral world seemed turned upside down. Those writings matter. They preserve memory, fear, and political messaging. But they do not give us a neutral camera view. They were often composed later under rulers who had strong reasons to portray reunification as salvation after darkness. The more broken the past appeared, the more legitimate the new order could seem. Archaeology gives a more uneven picture. Some regions show disruption, others show continued activity, tomb building, local patronage, and the persistence of administration. That does not mean conditions were easy. It means the collapse was patchy. One district may have suffered hunger and insecurity, while another adapted through local leadership and surviving networks of exchange. In that sense, the end of the Old Kingdom did not erase Egyptian civilization. It redistributed power and risk. And that redistribution shaped how people experienced the crisis, not as one single catastrophe everywhere at once, but as a narrowing world in which local conditions mattered more than ever. Some of the most vivid voices from this era come from provincial elites, men who presented themselves as protectors in a hungry land. Among the best known is Pepi, a governor from Upper Egypt, whose tomb inscription describes famine, conflict, and his own generosity. He speaks as a man who fed the hungry, defended his people, and acted decisively, while others failed. It is a dramatic portrait, but it is also an autobiography carved for posterity, designed to magnify its subject. That double nature makes such texts both valuable and difficult. They may preserve real memories of scarcity and regional struggle. They may also exaggerate danger to make local rulers appear heroic. In times of weak central power, this kind of self-presentation becomes especially important. A provincial leader is no longer simply an obedient servant of the king. He becomes the public face of security itself. He claims credit for grain, justice, and peace. He turns governance into reputation. Even if we read these inscriptions with caution, they still reveal something essential. The moral economy of Egypt had changed. In the great age of pyramid kingship, abundance flowed downward from a powerful center, at least in official ideology. Now, the local governor could cast himself as the man who kept people alive. That is a profound shift. It tells us that authority was being rebuilt at the provincial level, not only through titles and offices, but through acts of provision, or at least through the public claim of provision. Hunger, whether widespread or regionally uneven, gave ambitious men a new language of power. As the old monarchy fragmented, new centers of power emerged. Two names become especially important in the broad outline of the period: Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. Neither simply inherited the uncontested authority once claimed by Old Kingdom kings. Each had to build power in a divided country where loyalties were local, communications uneven, and legitimacy still under negotiation. This was not yet reunified Egypt. It was a map of competing claims. One ruler might hold influence over a chain of districts, while another controlled a different corridor of the Nile. Alliances mattered. So did marriages, military expeditions, and the ability to reward supporters with office and land. In such conditions, kingship did not disappear, but it changed in character. Instead of resting on a long, unquestioned concentration of resources, it had to prove itself amid rivals. Here we can see why the fall of the Old Kingdom was more than the death of one dynasty. It opened a long argument about who could govern Egypt and on what terms. Heracleopolitan rulers attempted to anchor authority in the north. Theban rulers expanded from the south. Between them stood local elites who were rarely passive. They could support, resist, or switch allegiance as circumstances changed. The Nile still linked the country, but politically it had become a contested corridor. The memory of unity remained powerful. Yet memory alone could not command boats, grain, and men. A new state would have to be assembled piece by piece in competition with other versions of order. It is tempting to imagine collapse as silence. Temples abandoned, art forgotten, writing interrupted. But history is rarely so clean. During the first intermediate period, cultural life did not simply stop. In some places, local elites commissioned tombs, inscriptions, and objects that reflected both continuity and change. The scale might be smaller than the grand royal projects of earlier centuries, yet the impulse to memorialize, to write, and to shape the afterlife remained deeply alive. In fact, periods of decentralization can produce their own creative energy. When power is dispersed, more regions begin to speak in their own voice. Provincial workshops develop local styles. Local rulers sponsor art that emphasizes their own authority and moral role. Administrative habits survive in altered form. Religious practice continues even as access to resources changes. The old language of kingship still matters, but it now shares space with stronger regional identities. This matters because it changes how we define collapse. If we judge only by the ability of a single king to command the whole land, then the old kingdom ended in failure. But if we look at social and cultural continuity, the picture becomes more complicated. Egypt was wounded, not erased. Its institutions bent, fractured, and reassembled at different scales. That resilience helps explain why reunification was possible later. A civilization can survive the breakdown of one political form if enough habits, symbols, and practical skills endure beneath the surface. In the first intermediate period, those deeper continuities were still there, carried by priests, scribes, craftsmen, farmers, and local households who continued the work of life even when the old state had splintered. Over time, out of this fractured landscape, a stronger southern power began to rise. The rulers of Thebes expanded their reach, contested their rivals, and gradually developed the capacity to reunify the country. This process did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It was gradual. Military pressure mattered, but so did administration, alliance building, and the recovery of confidence in kingship. A ruler had to do more than defeat enemies. He had to persuade Egypt that order could once again be made durable. That achievement is usually associated with Mentuhotep II, whose reunification of Egypt around 2005 BCE brought the first intermediate period to an end and opened the Middle Kingdom. In hindsight, his success can make the earlier fragmentation look like an interlude between stronger ages. But for the people living through it, the outcome was not guaranteed. Reunification had to be constructed from the same materials that had survived collapse. Local institutions, regional elites, agricultural recovery, and the enduring prestige of the idea of a united two lands. And that may be the clearest lesson of the Old Kingdom's fall. States do not vanish only when walls are breached or capitals burned. They can thin out from within. Their revenues soften. Their commands travel less far. Their local servants become local masters. Then, when environmental stress arrives, the whole system loses its ability to absorb shock. Yet collapse is not the end of history. In Egypt, the ruins of one centralized order became the foundation of another. The Old Kingdom fell because too many pressures converged on a system that had lost flexibility. The Middle Kingdom would rise by solving that problem in a new way. And in the next part, we can begin to ask what that new solution looked like, and what the memory of collapse taught later Egyptian rulers. What emerged after the Old Kingdom was not simply a repaired version of the same machine. The rulers who eventually rebuilt Egypt had inherited a warning. They had seen what happened when prestige outgrew flexibility, when too much depended on the aura of the king, and too little on the durability of administration across the land. Reunification, when it came, would still speak the language of divine kingship. Egyptian monarchy remained sacred, but the Middle Kingdom that followed carried a different political memory. Later rulers presented themselves not only as monument builders, but as restorers of balance after fracture. That distinction matters. The ideal of order of Maat had always been central. Yet after the first intermediate period, order could no longer be assumed as the natural byproduct of royal magnificence alone. It had to be maintained more actively. Provincial power had to be managed, not ignored. Local elites had to be integrated into a broader state structure without being allowed to become entirely separate centers of legitimacy. In that sense, the fall of the Old Kingdom became a lesson in statecraft. A kingdom could not rely forever on inherited awe. It needed a resilient flow of grain, officials who remained accountable, and a political system that could survive more than 1 weak reign. The memory of fragmentation likely sharpened all of these concerns. Egypt did not abandon its past. It studied it, absorbed it, and rebuilt around its weaknesses. So the collapse was not only an ending, it was also a teacher. The Old Kingdom had shown what centralized splendor could achieve. Its breakdown showed what that splendor had failed to secure. There is a temptation in historical storytelling to search for one decisive cause. One bad ruler, one drought, one revolt, one fatal mistake. But the end of the Old Kingdom resists that kind of neatness. The evidence points instead to an accumulation of pressures that became dangerous together. Provincial officials grew stronger over generations. Royal endowments and religious institutions may have narrowed the court's fiscal freedom. A very long reign may have complicated succession and weakened cohesion at the center. Then, environmental stress, including low Nile floods, appears to have struck a system already less capable of absorbing shock. None of these factors needs to carry the entire explanation alone. In fact, each becomes easier to understand when placed beside the others. Climate stress mattered more because administration had become less cohesive. Decentralization mattered more because resources were tighter. Succession uncertainty mattered more because regional elites were already entrenched. The whole process resembles not a sudden blow, but a structure whose supports had been gradually thinned. That does not make the story vague. It makes it human. Real states usually fail through interaction, not simplicity. Their parts weaken at different speeds. Some institutions keep functioning even as others fray. Outsiders looking back may see a date and call it collapse. People living through it may have felt something slower and stranger. Authority that still existed on paper but no longer traveled with the same force. This is why historians remain cautious. The Old Kingdom did not vanish in a single dramatic instant. It unraveled, and in unraveling revealed how complex power had always been. Much of what we know about the Old Kingdom's fall comes not from one clear narrative, but from fragments. Tomb inscriptions, administrative traces, changes in burial customs, monument size, distribution of wealth, settlement evidence, climate data recovered through scientific study. Each category offers part of the picture, but none speaks with a perfect voice. Archaeology is powerful precisely because it preserves what no royal historian intended to record. At the same time, it is uneven. Some regions are better preserved than others. Some elites left abundant material. Farmers, laborers, and the poor often appear only indirectly. Written sources are also difficult. Later literary texts that describe suffering and disorder are often emotionally vivid, but their historical value must be handled carefully. A text may reflect memory, moral warning, political argument, or literary convention rather than direct eyewitness testimony. The famous admonitions of Ipuwer is a good example. It is often quoted as if it were a journalist's report from the collapse, but its date, genre, and relationship to actual events remain debated. It may preserve echoes of disruption, yet it cannot simply be read as transparent fact. Even king lists create uncertainty. Later traditions speak of rapid turnover after the 6th dynasty, but the exact sequence of rulers in the 7th and 8th dynasties is still difficult to reconstruct with confidence. So when we ask why the Old Kingdom collapsed, we are also asking how historians build knowledge from incomplete evidence. The result is not ignorance, it is disciplined humility. We know enough to trace the major patterns, but the silences in the record remind us that the past is recovered, never fully possessed. The word collapse is useful, but also dangerous. It captures the failure of centralized monarchy at the end of the Old Kingdom. It marks the loss of the old political arrangement centered on Memphis and the weakening of royal command across the two lands. In that sense, something real did break. Yet the same word can mislead if it suggests that Egypt became an empty ruin or a civilization without continuity. That is not what the evidence shows. Religious practices continued. Local administration continued. Burial traditions changed, but did not disappear. Art adapted. Provincial elites sponsored their own monuments and inscriptions. Communities still farmed, traded, worshipped, and negotiated authority in daily life. Even during political fragmentation, Egypt remained deeply Egyptian. The Nile still ordered existence. The scribal habit still mattered. The moral language of order still carried force. So perhaps the better phrase is a collapse of one scale of power. The national state fractured. The old concentration of wealth and legitimacy around the king diminished. But society itself persisted, and in some places local life may even have become more visible because royal institutions no longer overshadowed every source of prestige. What was lost at the center could, to a degree, be redistributed in the provinces. This does not romanticize the transition. Periods of scarcity and conflict could be severe. Political fragmentation had costs. But it reminds us that ancient societies were not passive machines waiting for a central switch to be turned off. They contained many layers of resilience. And that may be the most accurate way to understand the Old Kingdom's end. Not as extinction, but as a profound reorganization under stress. When we look back at the Old Kingdom, it is easy to be dazzled by its stone. The pyramids still dominate the imagination. They suggest permanence. They suggest command on a scale beyond ordinary politics. But the deeper lesson of the Old Kingdom is not that power can build forever. It is that even the most confident states depend on quiet systems beneath the monument. Harvests, taxation, trust, communication, succession, and the willingness of local people to keep serving a common center. Egypt's early monarchy mastered concentration. It gathered labor, surplus, symbolism, and sacred authority into one of the ancient world's most impressive political experiments. For centuries, that experiment worked. Then gradually, almost invisibly at first, the conditions that had sustained it began to change. Wealth drifted outward. Authority dispersed. The river became less generous in crucial years. The center lost room to adapt. By the time fragmentation was obvious, the deeper weakening had already been underway for generations. That is why the Old Kingdom still feels modern in an unexpected way. Its end speaks to a timeless problem. Great systems rarely collapse only from the force that strikes them last. More often, they fail because earlier strengths have hardened into vulnerabilities. Institutions built for one age cannot always survive another without reform. And yet, Egypt's story does not end in warning alone. Out of decentralization came new political thinking. Out of strain came reorganization. Out of broken unity came a kingdom rebuilt on altered foundations. The Old Kingdom fell. But in falling, it taught later Egypt how states endure, how they fracture, and how memory itself can become a tool of renewal. In the next part, we move fully into that rebuilt world and ask how the rulers of the Middle Kingdom turned the memory of collapse into a new vision of order. When later Egyptian rulers looked back on the end of the Old Kingdom, they did not remember it simply as a change of dynasty. They remembered it as a warning. The image of a weakened crown, hungry provinces, and broken order became politically useful. It offered a contrast. If a new king could restore balance, feed the land, and speak for all Egypt again, then he was not just another ruler. He was the answer to an old failure. This is one of the most important legacies of the Old Kingdom's collapse. It shaped the political imagination of the Middle Kingdom. The memory of disorder, whether fully historical or partly moralized in later texts, helped define what good kingship should look like. A strong ruler now had to do more than command labor for monuments. He had to present himself as guardian of justice, provider in hard times, and restorer of Ma'at, the principle of right order that held society, kingship, and the cosmos together. That does not mean Middle Kingdom rulers invented these ideas from nothing. Ma'at was already ancient. Royal duty was already sacred. But the trauma of fragmentation gave these ideas sharper force. The state that emerged after reunification had studied the weaknesses of its predecessor, even if not in the language modern historians would use. It had seen what happened when provincial elites grew too entrenched, when the center lost its grip, and when legitimacy could no longer be taken for granted. So the collapse of the Old Kingdom mattered, not only because it ended one age. It mattered because it became a lesson in statecraft, in memory, in fear. The Pyramid Age had shown what royal power could build. The centuries after it taught what royal power had to preserve. And in that long Egyptian memory, ruin was never only an ending. It was also instruction. When Egypt was reunified under Theban rulers around the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, the new monarchy did not simply rebuild the Old Kingdom in its earlier form. It answered it. That distinction matters. The restored state was still royal, still hierarchical, still deeply religious, but it was also more self-conscious. It ruled in the shadow of remembered fragmentation. Middle Kingdom kings presented themselves as active managers of order. They invested in administration. They paid close attention to provincial power. They worked to bind local elites more tightly to the crown. Monument building continued, but the meaning of kingship widened. The ruler was not only the distant owner of divine splendor. He was increasingly portrayed as the one who stabilizes borders, protects the weak, hears petitions, and secures food and justice. This is visible not just in political structure, but in literature and royal ideology. Texts from the Middle Kingdom often show a striking concern with instability, loyalty, social obligation, and the burdens of rule. Some compositions look backward toward an age of upheaval, whether as memory, literary device, or both. In them, disorder becomes the dark mirror against which restored kingship is defined. This suggests something profound about the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Its consequences were not confined to the moment of breakdown. They entered the language of government. They influenced what rulers believed had to be controlled. They shaped how authority justified itself. A kingdom that once trusted inherited central power now had reasons to cultivate vigilance. In that sense, the Old Kingdom did not merely fall and vanish. It survived as a problem to be solved. The Middle Kingdom was one solution. Not a perfect one, not a permanent one, but a serious effort to learn from a former age in which grandeur had outlived flexibility. The pyramids remained on the horizon. The new kings ruled with them in mind, and with the warning, they silently carried. There is another reason the Old Kingdom's fall continues to matter. It still shapes how we think about collapse itself. Modern audiences often imagine collapse as a sudden event, a date, a conquest, a night when everything changes at once. But the end of the Old Kingdom resists that pattern. It unfolded over time, It mixed continuity with rupture. It preserved institutions even as political authority fragmented. That is why historians remain cautious. We can identify major pressures: fiscal strain from royal endowments, the rise of provincial autonomy, the complications of a very long reign near the dynasty's end, environmental stress linked to reduced Nile floods, and wider aridification. Yet none of these explains the entire story by itself. Each factor gains meaning through interaction with the others. A low Nile mattered more in a state already under strain. A powerful provincial governor mattered more when the center could no longer overawe him. A succession problem mattered more when resources were thinner and loyalties more local. The collapse, if we keep that word, was systemic, not because everything failed equally, but because multiple stresses converged on a political model that had become less adaptable than it once seemed. And perhaps that is why the story feels modern. Not because ancient Egypt was the same as the present. It was not. But because complex systems often do not break for simple reasons. They weaken unevenly. They compensate. They conceal their fragility behind outward normality. Then a pressure that might once have been survivable becomes decisive. The Old Kingdom's end, therefore, remains unfinished in one sense. It continues in scholarship because new evidence may alter the balance of explanation. And it continues in thought because it forces us to ask a difficult question. When does stability stop being strength and start becoming inertia? Ancient Egypt does not give a final answer. It gives a case study written across centuries of stone, flood, drought, ambition, and memory. In the end, the most powerful symbol of the Old Kingdom may also be the most misleading. The pyramids look eternal. They suggest permanence, control, a state so strong that it could command stone on a scale almost beyond belief. And for a time, that impression was true. The Old Kingdom was one of the ancient world's great achievements in centralized power, economic coordination, religious imagination, and political symbolism. But the same monuments also hide a paradox. They were built by a system that depended on balance between court and province, between taxation and obligation, between sacred authority and practical administration, between the generosity of the Nile and the demands of the state. Once those balances shifted too far, magnificence could no longer guarantee resilience. That is the quiet lesson. Egypt's pyramid age did not end because its people forgot how to build, or because one enemy smashed a perfect order from outside. It ended because internal structures changed, resources tightened, succession became uncertain, local powers hardened, and environmental stress exposed old weaknesses. The result was not total oblivion. It was transformation through strain. So if we ask why the Old Kingdom collapsed, the most honest answer is also the least dramatic. It collapsed because several long-building vulnerabilities converged within a system that had once seemed unmatched. Climate may have accelerated the crisis. Political decentralization made recovery harder. Fiscal pressure reduced flexibility. Dynastic uncertainty weakened the center. Together, they turned stress into fragmentation. And yet, the final image need not be one of silence. Egypt endured, it adapted, it remembered. The stone mountains at Giza still catch the light, but their deeper meaning may lie not in their scale alone. It lies in what followed them. A civilization learning painfully and imperfectly that no order is everlasting unless it can change. That may be the truest answer the Old Kingdom leaves behind.